guys, this is James with Crawlersncustoms, and today we're going to go over the lowering kit install on a bone stock F450, and we're going to be installing all of the parts and pieces necessary to get it to fully tuck the front and rear wheels and to utilize the super scale module. So when we finish in about 2 or 3 hours, we're going to have a truck that looks like this. Obviously there's some work to do, so we're going to go step by step so you guys know exactly what it takes to do the work and exactly what tools will be necessary. So necessary tools. You mostly need all of this. There's a couple things you can do without, but I wouldn't recommend it. One, we're going to need a Dremel to do some of the body work, and we're going to need it specifically to cut things like the rear axles with a cutting disc. You can also use a handsaw if you have one of those. That's actually what I use, but as a hobbyist, you should have a Dremel. Next, you need some sort of flat file. This is to file the flat spots on the rear axles. Doesn't take long, it's probably 90 seconds per axle, but you definitely need a way to put a flat spot on them. Highly recommended for this kit is a speed driver. This is a low torque driver with some MIP bits, the 1.5, 2, and 2.5. So make sure you have one of these, or make sure your wrist is up to the challenge of turning lots of bolts. Nut driver to remove the wheels. Later on, after we do this install video, you'll need to do some wiring. So you're going to need to have a soldering iron. The drill's on the desk because we need to do something that I like to call a poor man's lathe. But later on, we're going to be taking, we'll pretend this is the axle. We're going to be taking the axle, inserting it into our drill, and we're going to just take down about 1/10 of a millimeter of the axle diameter. So what we do is we spin up both the drill and the Dremel, and with the sanding drum, we sand that down, so that we're going to review that in a later video. If you don't have a miscellaneous bolt set, you need to pick up one of these M3 bolt kits. So you can see there's assorted sizes. You can get through about 99% of the build without using this, but eventually you'll need a couple smaller bolts that we're unable to reuse from the disassembly. If you have, a miscellaneous jar of M3 hardware, you should be okay. If you have no spare nuts and bolts, you need to buy this. Calipers are handy. It's not completely necessary, but it will speed up your checking of the axle progress as you're cutting and filing it down. So this is beneficial, not necessary. You don't need it if you don't already have one. The electronics that are going to be necessary. The heart of my truck is a super scale module. These things are really cool. I suggest you watch some of his YouTube videos or Instagram videos at Super Scale 2020 so you understand how this works. But basically, it's controlling servos. You need 4 servos for this system. 4 25 to 35 kilogram would be fine. I've used both. Any cheap servo would probably be okay, standard size. To power those 4 servos, you're going to want a standalone BEC. The BEC that's in your stock ESC is not strong enough, and if you attempt to power 4 servos with it, you'll simply burn it up, so don't do that. Get yourself at least a 10 amp BEC. This will take power directly from the battery and power the servos and super scale. In order to control those things, you need a programmable transmitter. I happen to use Spectrum, so I have an inexpensive 3-channel Spectrum receiver, and the auxiliary channel is what's plugged into the super scale, and that's what allows me to control the ride height live while I'm driving from the transmitter. You could get away without using a super scale. You would have to be able to control 4 servos, so that's up to you if you go down that road. You'd need to probably pair them up and run them off a Y harness and do some programming in your transmitter. Lastly, since it's not quite a tool and we talked about it before, if you don't have miscellaneous M3 bolts in a bin from your other hobby projects, make sure you grab an M3 bolt kit. This is, I think, 6 millimeters to 20 millimeters. On the previous builds, I've gotten through about 98% of it without needing to go into any extra resource for hardware, because the kit comes with a lot of hardware, and when we disassemble the truck, we're going to end up with a lot of hardware. So we're going to keep all those nuts and bolts and reuse them through the majority of the build. But again, if you don't have any spare bolts sitting around, buy one of these kits, it'll make it. So we've got our bone stock truck here. Let's start to tear it down. So first step, body pins. Now I have a little bin off camera to store all these parts, so I suggest you do the same. And we're going to be keeping all of the hardware in a separate container. So let's get the body off first. All right, so one bone stock truck. First order of business is let's remove wheels and tires. It's pretty easy. If you look close, there are two bolts that actually hold the cover on. Fat fingers won't let me bring this up. Let's try. Get a driver in here. Okay. Keep your spare parts or your original parts in a bin. Now for the hardware, just get yourself a little small container like one of these and keep them organized. In this case, we're taking out the M2.5 by 8, I believe. So we're going to put them in this container. We're going to be removing all of the bolts from the wheels here in just a second. The process will be the same for all 4 corners. We're just going to do one corner and fast forward through the rest. So now you can see we've got our axle nut. All right, repeat this process for the other 3 corners. I'm going to be quiet in this part so we can fast forward. All right, so we've got our wheels, tires, and hexes removed. The reason I pulled the hexes is because they tend to fall off and the pin falls out and then you can't find it. And so we just remove them now to save us grief later on. Let's go ahead and reposition the battery. So we're going to rotate it onto this bracket. The bolts are under these straps. Oh, there goes one forever. And we found the last bolt. We're going to reuse these locations and those 4 bolt patterns. So it's going to drop in just like that. All right, so we've got our battery repositioned. Let's go ahead and start disassembly of the rest of the rig. So at this point, the whole front and back end basically need to come off. So you can start with your body posts. Again, keep your handy hardware holder set aside, and let's go ahead and start to remove some of this stuff. So I'm going to put some of the shorter bolts together, and the medium, and then the longer bolts. Forgot my nut driver. So we're going to open up this little link because there are some grub screws in here that you might want for later parts of the build. I didn't utilize them, but we'll show you where those come into play with an option for the bed mount. put our shocks aside. And basically just keep taking apart the front end. In this case, the rear end, sorry. Set your shock aside. Let's grab our grub screw while we're here. Sway bars are in the way, so they come off. At this point, we can start to pull apart, pull off the rear axle. We are going to be reusing these lower links in the upper location. For these types of bolts that we know we're going to use again, I like to put them back in just lightly threaded so we don't have to look for them later on. So these are M2.5, a little bit longer, put them back with the 2.5s. This panhard bracket needs to come off. Now if you reuse these bits of hardware here, you'll see they're a little bit long. So I'm not going to do that. We're going to pick up a couple from our kit that are a little bit shorter. Put our long bolts back with our long bolts. And let's try these two, which we already removed. are still too long. Let's go a little shorter. There, it looks better. Not the perfect length, so let's just leave that off for now. And let's put our rear axle aside and move on to the front end. That is after we finish back here. And now we're just going to loosen the back of the frame. All right, that's what we're left with on the back of the truck. Same process for the front.
All right, so
last step on the disassembly is to take this ESC and receiver plate off. The way that you have to do that is to loosen these 4 bolts. So you can move the transmission out of the way. And let's put those 4 bolts right back in where we found them. Okay, you should be left with a bare chassis. Let's take that bracket out. Way to do it, by the way. Just loosen these bolts. You don't take them all the way out, just loosen all 4. So you can open the frame up a little bit and pop that out. Tighten those back down. All right, next video, we're going to start rebuilding.